Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session, JFK Assassination 101. I'm Michael Kurtz, and I'll be your moderator. And I want to say one thing first of all. Ben Wecht, next time you invite us to a session, make sure that we precede Cyril instead of succeed him. I don't think we'll be able to top that. Tonight, by way of introduction, I'd like to give a very brief, very perfunctory overview of what happened in Dallas that day, because we have a number of high school and young college students who perhaps aren't familiar with the facts of the assassination. President Kennedy was assassinated while he was riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. It happened on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy was riding in a limousine in the right rear seat. Next to him was his wife, Jacqueline. In folding jump seats in front of the Kennedys were Governor and Mrs. Connally, and in the front seat were two Secret Service agents. After the limousine went through the main streets of downtown Dallas, quite literally on Main Street, it made a right-hand turn and traveled for 1 block on Houston Street, then made a left-hand turn onto Elm Street. After the limousine had proceeded a brief way on Elm Street, shots were fired. Both President Kennedy and Governor Connally were hit, and the motorcade raced to nearby Parkland Hospital. Kennedy and Connally were taken into emergency rooms, where President Kennedy, after being given emergency resuscitation measures, was pronounced dead. Governor Connally, of course, was taken upstairs to surgery and recovered from his wounds. Approximately 45 minutes after the assassination, that is at 1:15 p.m., roughly speaking, J.D. Tippit, a Dallas police officer, was shot and killed in a residential area of Dallas about 4 miles from Dealey Plaza. A half hour after that, at about 1:45 p.m., a 24-year-old young man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the Texas Theater about 5 blocks from the scene of the Tippit killing. Oswald was taken to Dallas Police Headquarters and originally charged with the murder of Officer Tippit. And later that night, of course, as you all know, he was charged with the murder of President Kennedy. 2 days later, Jack Ruby walked into the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters and, on one of the most dramatic incidents ever witnessed on live television, shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. With Oswald, the only suspect in custody, dead, no trial, of course, could be held, and therefore the new President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, after several days of debate, appointed a commission chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren to investigate the assassination. 9 months later, that commission, commonly called the Warren Commission, presented its report to President Johnson, and the report, of course, said Oswald did it all by himself. There was no conspiracy. Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy. He also acted alone in killing Officer Tippit. And also, by the way, Jack Ruby acted alone, no conspiracy, in killing Oswald. A rash of books critical of the Warren Commission report was published in the mid and late 1960s, and the Zapruder film, originally shown only in brief frames by Life magazine, was finally shown on national television in 1975, and a new investigation, that of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, was conducted in the late 1970s, and that commission, unlike the Warren Commission, concluded that the assassination of President Kennedy probably resulted from a conspiracy. That evidence was based primarily on the committee's review of Dallas police audio tapes of gunfire in Dealey Plaza. The final, and I'm skipping over several investigations in between, but the final major inquiry came after the public showing of the movie JFK in 1991 and 1992. The public outcry after viewing that movie led Congress to pass the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. And President Bush signed the act into law, and President Clinton appointed 5 members of that board, not to investigate the assassination so much as to release records relating to the assassination that had been suppressed all those years. Over the next few years, that is in the mid and late 1990s, more than 4 million pages of evidence relating to the Kennedy assassination has been released, and scholars, of course, are still going over all of that material to this day. With that brief background in mind, I'd like now to turn our presentation over to our distinguished panel members. And before I do, I just want to say one thing, and I know I can speak for all of the panelists and all of the panelists who will be appearing later in the week. A warm word of thanks to Elaine Edwards, Ben Wecht, Cyril Wecht, Duquesne University, and everybody responsible for making this conference such a rousing success, as the audience here clearly indicates. Thank you all very much. The distinguished members of our panel have already been introduced, and therefore I'd like to go ahead and start. The format is this. Each member of our panel, beginning with Dr. Brown in alphabetical order, will present rather brief remarks relating to some aspect of the Kennedy assassination. After they are finished with their remarks, I will ask each of them one question related to what they said. They will respond very briefly, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers from you, the members of the audience. I'd like to begin with Dr. Walt Brown.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, you'll regret it. We kind of have the first controversy of the evening because although our panel moderator said, you know, it's really a tough act to follow when Cyril speaks, I love it when he does my warm-up. So I also want to thank him for pointing out that what Roosevelt and Eisenhower and Kennedy were doing to their mistresses, the U.S. government is doing to all of us today. And I'd also like to add that since both sides are represented here, we should pretty much identify ourselves. I'm one of the 85% that doesn't go along with the Warren Commission. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I'm one of the percentage that thinks sex is a good sport. So that said, he spoke of some unanswered questions. And I think what he said and what Dr. Kurtz said leads very nicely into what I was going to say. The shots happened at 12:29 or 12:30. The Dallas police immediately began gathering evidence and suspects. The suspects totaled 13 in number. You're aware of one of them, Lee Harvey Oswald. At the same time, the FBI sprang into the case, in which they had absolutely no jurisdiction. There was no law in 1963 against an assault, or in this case a murder, of the President of the United States. It was illegal to assault a park ranger, but not the President, federally. They sprang into the case so fast that an FBI man arrived at Parkland Hospital with a doctor, which tells you something about the FBI, because they could have probably figured since it's a hospital, there are doctors there, particularly since the President was there. He didn't get in. By midnight, as was noted in the press conference, J. Edgar Hoover, and let's just say he's a man of many idiosyncrasies, had convicted one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the most necessary idiosyncrasy that you need to know is that when J. Edgar Hoover said something, every FBI man that cared about his job, his income, his pension, his future, his family, next year's turnip crop, is going to say, yes, sir, that's the way it happened. And they won't wear red ties or have sweaty palms or step on his shadow, because that would get you fired. Within 12 hours of the conviction of Oswald, which means that name that Cyril said, that I'm not going to repeat, who wrote Case Closed. The case was closed in November of '63. He didn't have to wait 35 years to write that book. Within 12 hours of the arrest of Oswald, all of the evidence left Dallas, Texas. to Washington, and about 1% of it ever found its way back to Dallas, Texas. Even though it's a Dallas, Texas case, and it is still an open homicide in Dallas only. And I went through this with my students this past week, and we can do it kind of a two-part audience here. If I challenged that side of the room to go out and research and give a complete, thorough, and total answer, and I challenged this side of the audience to go out and research and study and find everything there is to know about the mating habits of gorillas, and then you all run to the library, and this side takes out half the books, and that side takes out half the books, which side is going to give me the whole story of the case? And the answer is nobody. Because when you start dividing up resources, it's gone. Well, the resources weren't even divided up. The FBI had them, and we haven't seen them since. There was at that time an incredible public outrage. For those of you that are not old enough to remember what it was like, if you go back to 9/11, that was a part of what happened in November. 9/11 took time to play out. With John Kennedy, shots were fired in 6 seconds and he was dead, and it was over, very suddenly. The state of Texas, the House of Representatives, the United States Senate were all going to investigate thoroughly, and not the mating habits of gorillas, the murder of John F. Kennedy. They were prevented, frozen out, shut off, shut down by the appointment by Lyndon Johnson, FBI Director Hoover's neighbor for 19 years, of something called the President's Commission on the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Warren Commission. They did not hire investigators. They chose instead to rely on the FBI. Which brings us to a problem. On December 9th, two things happened. The Warren Commission, newly appointed, had their first ever sit-down for a photo opportunity. They didn't have any data, they didn't have any witnesses, just got together, had their picture taken, appeared in a newspaper next day. The same day, the FBI issued a 5-volume report, sometimes known as the Gemberling Report, which concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in the murder of John F. Kennedy. And of course, I asked my students again this week, how many of you would want to sign up for a class where you have to read a 5-volume reading list? And none of them wanted to. I said, well, those 5 volumes are less than 300 pages total. But it sounded good in the news to say the FBI today released a 500-page report, 5-volume report. It's about that thick. Oswald did it. That report and the Warren report 10 months later are identical, except for one sentence. And that one sentence is that in the Gemberling report, it says this investigation will continue for all time until every possible lead is played out. You won't find that in the Warren report. The Warren report, the Warren Commission, 73 days later, called their first 3 witnesses. Now keep in mind, they're an independent, fact-finding body investigating the murder of John Kennedy. They're coming into this with no preconceived notions whatsoever. And the day they took the first testimony, Earl Warren announced that there was things that they were going to be dealing with that you will not learn in your lifetime. Well, that's about the only thing they got right. And the 3 witnesses they called on the first day were Marina Oswald, Robert Oswald, and Marguerite Oswald, coincidentally related to a stock boy along the motorcade route in a totally unbiased investigation. I think you know where the investigation was headed once you got those 3 people on the witness stand. So that's, for my few minutes, that's where the unanswered question comes from. But there's one question we can answer, and I think it needs asking after seeing that video tonight. That's real simple. And you can answer with your applause or whatever. How many of you would prefer John Kennedy in the White House today to W? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The other member of our panel, Mr. Jared Policoff, just arrived, and he'd like a few minutes for a breather and to go over his notes. So if you don't mind, I'll go ahead with Zachary Sklar.
Well, I am not a serious researcher or a historian, as my colleagues are on this panel. I am a screenwriter. But I have always been fascinated by the Kennedy assassination because I was 15 when it happened, and it had a big emotional impact on me. And I've always thought about its importance, what the significance of it is. Forgive me for using a movie metaphor, but for me, and I think for millions of Americans, the Kennedy assassination and the aftermath, the so-called investigations, the cover-ups, were like something out of The Wizard of Oz, particularly the scene in which Toto, the little dog, pulls back the curtain, and you see that there is this other man manipulating behind the scenes what is being said out in public by the wizard. For me, that's the metaphor. The assassination and the aftermath are the moment when millions of Americans saw for themselves that there was an enormous gap between what they were told by their government and by the mainstream media and what was really going on behind the scenes. This was the first glimpse that we had of what I would call the invisible secret government. Now, the context for this was that Kennedy in 1960, when he was elected, this was a transitional time in our political history. In post-World War II America, 1950s, there was a great deal of trust in the American government because it had been the good guy in World War II, and I think there was a carryover effect of Americans' fight for freedom and against tyranny and so forth. On the surface, culturally, we were watching Ozzie and Harriet on television, Leave It to Beaver, and we had this idea that everything was tranquil and wonderful. But underneath, in a different reality, behind the curtain, there was fear and hysteria. This is the same country in which while Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet are on television, there's blacklisting going on, there's McCarthyism. On the surface, we're being told that America is in favor of freedom and democracy around the world, that it's fighting tyranny of communism. But underneath, behind the curtain, what's really happening is there's a consolidation of American empire. If you see that the foreign policy involves supporting dictators around the world, Syngman Rhee in South Korea, Trujillo in Dominican Republic, Batista in Cuba, etc. And at the same time, suppressing any kind of liberation movement that might arise that might make it uncomfortable for American corporations to do their work, get their free labor, get the natural resources that they need, so that secretly the CIA is working to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Lumumba in the Congo. So this is the context. There's two separate realities going on. One where we all think everything is fine on the surface, and another where we don't necessarily know because there's not the kind of investigative reporting that eventually started to happen. The transition time is when Kennedy comes into office. He's elected as a Cold Warrior, carry on this same anti-communist crusade, and at the beginning he does do that. I mean, the ouster of Chetty Jagan's government in Guyana was an example of that. But something happened very early in the Kennedy administration, which was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which he had inherited from the Eisenhower administration. And Kennedy felt that he had been betrayed by the CIA. He had not been informed about it. He refused air cover for it, and it was a disaster. From that moment, Kennedy did not trust the CIA and vice versa. Kennedy vowed to split the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He fired the three top officials of the CIA, Dulles, General Cabell, and Bissell. And then in October '62 came the Cuban Missile Crisis. Against the wishes of his advisors, Kennedy refused to invade Cuba. That was what the Joint Chiefs were advising him to do. Instead, he made a secret deal with Khrushchev that he would Khrushchev would withdraw the missiles, But in exchange, Kennedy would promise not to invade Cuba. Next, in the summer of '63, comes the nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. Once again, Kennedy going against the wishes of the Joint Chiefs and his top advisors. Later that year, Kennedy signs National Security Action Memorandum 263 to get the advisors out of Vietnam. At the same time, he's opened a back channel to Cuba, try to normalize diplomatic relations. These are all collectively things that were very antagonistic to the dominant ideology that had been in place since World War II, the anti-communist crusade. To people on the left, Kennedy did not seem like a radical of any sort, but to people on the right, in the military and in the intelligence establishments, these were very radical measures that Kennedy was doing. After Kennedy was assassinated, things went back to usual. Vietnam War was escalated. In 1965, when a communist government started to appear in the Dominican Republic, American troops landed in the Dominican Republic. '73, Allende's elected in Chile. He's overthrown with the help of the CIA. Later, Grenada, Maurice Bishop comes to power. He's overthrown, invaded. Nicaragua, Sandinista government comes to power. All of a sudden, there's an Iran-Contra war. Then we get into the Iran-Contra affair. Well, through all this, fortunately, I think the American people are starting to get much more than just the first glimpse we got from the Kennedy assassination. We're starting to see that there's a secret, invisible government with an ongoing foreign policy that is being done in our name, with our tax dollars, but with no accountability. So what William Casey used to call an off-the-shelf operation. Governments are being overthrown, leaders are being assassinated, all in our name, and we have no way to, there's no accountability for any of this. Fortunately, though, through Vietnam, we're getting a credibility gap. Watergate comes out, and we start to see the whole concept of cover-up and lies. The Church Committee meets, and we start to understand the way the CIA works. Then the Iran-Contra affair happens. And so there is a cumulative consciousness building up in the American people that that began with the Kennedy assassination, I believe, which started to realize, yes, we're told all these nice things in the cliches about freedom and democracy and fighting for, against communism or terrorism or whatever it is at the time, but what's really going on is a whole other thing that we don't know about, and what it really is doing is protecting American empire. There is a real politic going on here, which is really, now we're seeing it pretty blatantly, it's coming out in the current administration, which is called global dominance. That's what this Wolfowitz starts writing about. And it's really about assuring that we have oil. It's about assuring that we have cheap labor. There are finite resources in the world, and these, the people we're talking about are hell-bent on making sure that the American way of life, such as it is maintained, and that means that we have to have a certain amount of global domination. Well, I'm sorry, that's enough? Okay. I'll stop there. I mean, I think our work is to make sure that those two separate realities become one. That we understand. I think we had a little setback with the 9/11, in which people began to want to believe in Father again and believe in government and so forth. But I think even those lies are now coming out again, and I think the cumulative consciousness of the American people is becoming much more sophisticated about the lies that we've been told. And I think our goal should be open up everything, no secret government at all anymore.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jerry Policoff.
Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? All right. A lot of this tonight seems to be about context, and I think that's good and important because it really is important to set the context here 40 years later. It's fascinating to look at this room and see all these people here because I've been to a number of symposium, probably a dozen, since since they've been having these things. I don't think I've seen a crowd this large ever. And it says a lot that 40 years later we're still talking about this subject and I won't even say debating it, because I don't think it's really much of a debate. A few years ago, I was on a panel with Max Holland, who I think is going to be here covering this event this weekend, so he can tell the readers of The Nation that there was no conspiracy. And Max Holland basically talked about how the controversy began. And the way the controversy began was that the media jumped the gun and convinced the American public that there was a conspiracy. And the public was also willing to believe it, because the public always wants to believe in a conspiracy and doesn't really trust anything the government says. And it was pretty interesting that Max Holland said that, because in 1963, as we talked about context, it was a different world. I mean, we hadn't had the Pentagon Papers yet, we hadn't had Iran-Contra, we hadn't had Watergate, and the public was much more trusting of the government than it is today. And frankly, this case was a personal journey for me, because in 1963, I was 16 years old. I was fairly naive. I'd say very naive, although I'm not sure that it was that naive in the context of the day. And it never even occurred to me to question the Warren report. I'm sure today I would, or to question Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. I'm sure today it would occur to me immediately, but in 1963 it didn't. And it wasn't until 1966 that I became vaguely aware that there was a controversy going on, and at that point there had been several books come out: Inquest, Whitewash, Rush to Judgment. And I remember I read Inquest first, and in hindsight, Inquest isn't a terribly powerful book, but back then it was. And just reading Inquest, I remember reading it to convince myself that there was no conspiracy and everything was just fine. And it turned out I read Inquest, and I read Rush to Judgment, and I read Whitewash, and I was hooked, and I've been hooked ever since. And honestly, it was that later I started questioning the Vietnam War, but this really was the issue that catapulted me into questioning things that the government said and just not believing everything. But when you look back in 1963 and Max Holland's contention that it was the media, it wasn't the media. When you look at the early press reports directly after the assassination, I mean, there were multiple reports of people running towards the grassy knoll. The AP even said in their first dispatches that the shots apparently came from a grassy knoll in front of the limousine. There were multiple stories of people being arrested, and yet in spite of that, by the end of the day, it was clear that the official story was going to be coming out of the Dallas Police Department and the FBI. The official story was going to be that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin, and the media endorsed that official line very, very aggressively, and it was far from a rush to conspiracy theories by the media. When you look at all of the contradictory facts that were out in the first 24 hours, in spite of that, you saw the word alleged almost immediately disappear from the vocabulary in the media. You had headlines like "Left-wing lunacy," "Career of suspect has been bizarre," "Psychotic impulses that aided Lee Harvey Oswald," "Marksman Castro read," "Assassin named." The New York Times headlined on November 23rd that the evidence against Oswald was described as conclusive, and later their headline blared, "President's assassin shot." And it wasn't all passive. You had Dan Rather, who was then a stringer for CBS News, not a prominent national figure at all, received a private screening of the Zapruder film and got on national television and described the Zapruder film in great detail, and he said that it showed the president's head being driven violently forward. And of course, if the Zapruder film had been seen by the public back in 1963, one wonders whether Dan Rather would have eventually become the anchor person of the CBS Evening News. But that wasn't going to be, because Life magazine, or Time Inc., originally bought print rights to the Zapruder film. C.D. Jackson, who was the publisher of Life magazine, as soon as he saw the Zapruder film, ordered Richard Stoley, who had done the negotiation, to go back and get full rights. And then he ordered the film suppressed from public view, at least until emotions had subsided. But they weren't going to completely suppress the Zapruder film. There were well, early in the story, there was a controversy, of course, because there seemed to be a throat wound, an entrance wound in the throat, and many people were hypothesizing, how could a shot from behind have hit Kennedy in the throat? Well, Life magazine was certainly willing to answer that. They described the Zapruder film as showing Kennedy turning to wave to somebody in the crowd and exposing his throat to the sniper's nest. And of course, anybody who's seen the Zapruder film knows that that never happened, but it didn't stop Life, which was the only source of the film, from saying it happened. Later, in October of 1964, they published several frames of the Zapruder film with commentary. And it wasn't commentary that particularly suggested that there was a shot from the front, but it did show one of the frames after 3:13 where Kennedy was driven back against the seat, and the verbiage was a little ambiguous. So they broke the plates and they changed the verbiage, and it was a little less ambiguous, but it was still a little ambiguous. So they broke the plates again, and by the third time they had a list of frames and captions that pretty clearly said the shots had come from behind, and at that point they were happy. And that may not sound like a lot in a digital age, but in 1963 that was enormously expensive. That was something that just was unheard of. And a matter of fact, Dick Stoley, who was a main figure at Life at the time, told me a few years ago that he never even knew that it occurred, and he claimed to be astonished and admitted that that would have been unbelievably expensive and very out of the ordinary. But in spite of all of the efforts by the media, by 1966, as I said, you had Rush to Judgment coming out, you had Inquest coming out, and all of a sudden, several of these books rushed to the top of the bestseller list, and the media worked very hard then, too, to dispose of the controversy. You didn't see too many book reviews in the Washington Post, and Jeffrey Wolf, who is the book review editor of the Washington Post, wrote me several years later that in a editorial meeting with Benjamin Bradlee, the executive editor of the Washington Post, it was decided that he would review no books about the Kennedy assassination. And that wasn't something he revealed really too willingly. It was, I had caught him in some contradictions, and basically at the end of a long correspondence, that's what he admitted. Okay. I was also had the good fortune to be on a panel with John Leonard, who was the book review editor of the New York Times, and whenever books in the New York Times were reviewed about the Kennedy assassination, they were inevitably very jaded reviewers that had a position on the lone nut side of the fence. And I asked John Leonard how it came to be that type of reviewer was always selected to review those books, and he told me that invariably when a book hit his desk about the Kennedy assassination, it already had a reviewer assigned to it. My time's almost up, so I'm going to jump ahead. Today, the media, we're at the 40th anniversary. The media is still basically, for the most part, claiming that it was a lone assassin. ABC News is coming out with their new evidence supporting the lone assassin, and using consultants like Gus Russo, who have a clear position on the other side and are anything but objective. And if you believe the media today, the only reason that the American public doesn't believe the Warren report is because of that terrible movie that Oliver Stone brought out 10 years ago that just brainwashed all of us. And so I think context is important, and I think it's amazing to see a crowd like this on the 40th anniversary, and very encouraging. And This is why the public doesn't believe the Warren report, never has and never will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Policoff. Before he falls asleep, I'd like to call on Tony Summers, because Mr. Summers has come all the way from Ireland, just straight from the plane here.
No, I'm really not going to fall asleep. Good evening, everybody. I guess I'd like to introduce myself, since I'm a strange foreign alien interloper here. And by way of also talking a little bit about conspiracy, that we're talking, the subject for this day or two or three is the solving the great American murder mystery, and somehow with that comes the implication that we're talking about a conspiracy, and that many people believe that there was a conspiracy. I just missed being able to cover, as a young reporter, the assassination. I was 18 and I'd done a vacation stint on a public affairs program at the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. But I was working as a student at Oxford University in a pub, and the news came through on the radio that the president had been killed. And then the phone rang, and it was the editor of the program calling to say, could I go to London Airport and go on a chartered aircraft to Dallas? As an 18-year-old reporter, can you imagine that kind of a break? And except that they rang back about 10 minutes later, when I'd packed my toothbrush, to say that they'd found somebody with more experience. So I'd never got to Dallas on that occasion. And then time passed, and I became a journalist with the BBC. And I shrank from, like many other journalists of my generation, I shrank away from covering the case, especially after the Jim Garrison investigation in New Orleans, because it seemed to be a sort of mire of half-truth on both sides that was waiting to swallow up journalistic reputations. I don't think it was really a predatory kind of thing. I think people just thought, wait a minute, especially after the Jim Garrison thing. And then I got sucked in the late 70s, when the House Assassinations Committee was, I knew, going to come out with its conclusion. One knew several weeks, months before that there was likely to be some sort of conspiracy finding. And I made a documentary for the BBC again, and for public television here, reporting that, and then there was so much left over that I wrote a book. And those who praised the book said that the BBC approach persuaded them for the first time that the president may really have died as the result of a conspiracy. Others, most recently a columnist for Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, dubbed me a conspiracy theorist, and rather more mysteriously, certainly to my friends, a leftist. The word conspiracy derives from a Latin root that translates roughly as breathing together, which is a pretty desirable activity for plotters who want to stay in sync. History is full of real conspiracies: the stabbing of Julius Caesar, the shooting in Sarajevo that started World War I, to the Wannsee Conference, at which the Nazis, you might say, breathing together in terrible unison, laid the foundations for the Holocaust. The author Jonathan Vankin American author, concluded that, quote, "Now, conspiracy theories are a guide to life in a strange and threatening America, a conspiracy nation," end of the quote. He said he came away from working on the idea of conspiracy in general, asking questions about America and my own place in it that I'd never dared to ask before. Well, that can't be bad. But that said, the JFK case is cluttered, obscured even, by the nuttier theories. My Loonies file on the case contains marvelous gems. I've got a letter on the grand notepaper of the Institute of Moral and Political Law, which tells me that the JFK mystery is solved. And the assassin, by the way, was George Bush Sr. Another missive enclosed photos proving that a small dog traveled in the limousine with the president on the day he died, and the dog was in some way implicated in the murder plot. Conspiracy nuts do exist, and it's a handy slur to throw at troublesome people who aren't mad at all, as I found when the Kennedy book I did was first published. David Phillips, a former head of the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division, a name well known to my colleagues here, was furious because I had written in the book of troubling anomalies in his sworn testimony. Put a bit more bluntly, the staff of the Assassinations Committee in the Congress was quite sure that David Phillips had lied to them, and so I'd reported as much. Appearing opposite Phillips on the Today Show on NBC, I explained that what I'd written had been taken almost verbatim from the committee's published reports. And then Phillips produced his trump card. He said that the congressional investigator who'd written the offending words was, by his own admission, paranoid about the Kennedy assassination. I was ready for this because I'd been told in advance, decent people, some of them in the media, on Today, what he was going to do to me. And so I'd got hold of the investigator, whom I knew, and we tracked it back and realized that he'd written once in an obscure article, the investigator, had written that in the spate of assassinations in the 60s, it was enough to make any sane citizen start to think himself paranoid. And Phillips, the CIA man, was distorting what the investigator had written. I was able to defuse the smear on television by reading the passage out loud. You don't have to be much of an expert or a conspiracy monger to question the facts in the Kennedy case. There were so many blunders in the probe, so much mishandling of the evidence. And I'm sure that's what will be discussed in horrendous detail over the next day or two. So let me give you an example from my own experience in another case. In 1968, I happened to be one of the first journalists at the scene of the Martin Luther King murder. King had been shot in the early evening, and before breakfast the next morning, I was able to talk my way into the rooming house from which the fatal shot had apparently been fired. The policeman on the door said, "Oh, morning, sir," and then let me and my camera crew go in upstairs into the bathroom from which the shots had allegedly been fired, and we put our camera on the window frame and we trampled all over the murder scene. And Dr. Wecht would be the first to have the horrors about what happened. That place should have been sealed for days, if not weeks, after the event. And the point I'm getting at is that the screw-up theory of history is sometimes more valid than dark conspiracy theories. All the same, it's absolutely indefensible to shrug off inconvenient facts with easy generalities, or to dismiss competent researchers as paranoids. In general, I'm afraid it is true, even though I have been in my time part of the media, it is true that the media has done just that. And as often as not, to mask its own laziness and ineptitude and its failure to ask the difficult questions by dismissing those who ask the serious questions. But they failed entirely to make the difficult questions go away, which is one of the reasons that there are so many of you here tonight and so many around the world who are still asking the questions. And that is entirely thanks to the dedication of some of those who've organized this seminar. And even if, as I suspect, the questions never will now be answered, the best of those here today have done a sterling service, in my humble view as a foreigner, to their country and to history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Professor Wrone.
Thank you. Thank you. I've always found that when I approach the assassination of President Kennedy, it's good to understand the world in which he had his being. And that world, in its major dimensions, came into being right after World War II. After World War II, the United States underwent a radical transformation, both internally and externally. Externally, we waged what was called a Cold War, but at the same time we also waged a war of economic aggression. And these two were side by side and often indistinguishable, but they were two different systems. At the same time, we fought from 1945 until 1960 about 100 wars. Many very tiny frays, some small wars, some major conflicts, from Korea to the Philippines, to Greece, to Tibet, to Lebanon. And as we were fighting those wars, two extraordinary institutions came into being that we had not had before. One was the atomic system. And by 1960, when President Kennedy took office, we had H-bombs and A-bombs in submarines, in B-52s flying continuously, in missile silos around the world, in artillery shells and other places. And one H-bomb, as you perhaps know, if it went off, could take as much as 3 or 4 of our states of the United States and reduce them to glass. Extraordinarily powerful systems. At the same time, the intelligence system emerged, something we'd never had before in the United States. And this was a secret organization that emerged in rubble of post-war World War II. And by 1960, we had a powerful and extraordinary, but very, very secret intelligence service. And probably with the military in control of the nuclear weapons and waging the wars and so forth, and with the intelligence services there, you had two extraordinary, powerful organizations. But at the same time this is happening, something was happening internally that we often don't think about. Many of our major institutions were undergoing a change, becoming more brittle. And these included the law, with our show trials and all sorts of systems like that. Our academic world was changing. And we can go over a great list of these major institutions, sort of a byproduct of this great change within America. This had an impact upon us. And then when President Kennedy came into office, he had to confront a world that was vastly different from the one that he grew up in before the war, and the one which so many of us were familiar with. For example, in April 1962, he was taken to the Pentagon and showed their secret plan, April 62 plan it's called. And the plan was to launch a preemptive sneak attack on everything communist and socialist with 7,000 nuclear weapons. China, Albania, Russia. And when he left the Pentagon, he ordered them to put that plan in a safe and never mention it again. And remarked to military aid to camp as he left, and we call ourselves civilized. And then in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the most dire time, when the push was to invade, if he had given the go-ahead for war, what would have happened? He would have lost command of the military, because in war, the president doesn't command, the military does. And then you have those forces that control the military weaponry and the nuclear weapons. So it was a very, very extraordinary time in the history of all of the world. With his death, however, we find that when he's investigated, that death is investigated, that every one of our major institutions, that's the law, the press, the medical systems, the Congress, academia, the intelligentsia, every one of them failed to do what they should have done. As we'll find in this conference today, the medical system was almost collapsed. And any attorney reading the Warren report would immediately become aware that it's based on lawyer-generated evidence, reenactments, and hearsay. Just an unbelievable shambles. The press didn't investigate the assassination, didn't send their own private teams down to Dallas to double-check on authorities. And we can go on with this. And so to me, the assassination of John Kennedy has this larger importance of the inability or failure of our nation in this severe time of crisis, when the man with his hand on the nuclear trigger, the man constitutionally elected, man who represented 200 years of our history, thwarted by assassins' bullets. The importance is what happened to our society here. And what's more important even, those same institutions, law, press, medicine, have continued in our society not to function as fully as they can. So I believe that as you go into the assassination of President Kennedy, you have to ask yourself the question, what is the law? What ought it to do? What is a lawyer? How ought they to practice? Should justice be done though the heavens fall? What is a doctor? And what should the press have done? And I think those are the paramount questions in the assassination. And that takes people who are rainy day soldiers and winter patriots. And it's very difficult. And this conference will bring out a lot of those issues. So I hope we can remember this larger world. And thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to ask one question to each of our panelists, and I'd like a very brief, no more than 1 minute answer to the question, even though these are somewhat loaded questions. Dr. Brown, what happened to the other 12 suspects?
Have you ever walked through a revolving door?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the worst thing about it is they vanished from the pages of history. At least we should know who they were and why what they were doing as suspects and why they were released. But in they came, out they went, because we had Oswald. That's all you needed. And as Jerry said, he was a Castro Red, he was all of that nasty stuff. He was perfect.
Okay. Mr. Sklar. I know their personalities were different, but were JFK's policies really that different from LBJ? After all, didn't Johnson push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Didn't he push Medicare, Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Didn't Johnson continue with Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, and all of Kennedy's people in office? So couldn't you argue that Johnson really was a continuation of Kennedy?
Yes, you could argue that. Johnson did carry on with a lot of the legislation that Kennedy had originated, and he was a very good legislator and got through a lot of stuff that Kennedy probably couldn't have gotten through. The big difference, I would argue, is in Kennedy's relationship to the CIA and to the national security establishment. And that was where he had defied it repeatedly. That's not something you found Lyndon Johnson doing. Kennedy had signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, which was to remove the advisors from Vietnam. 4 days after the assassination, Johnson signed a National Security Action Memorandum 273, which essentially opened the door for United States forces to carry out military actions in Vietnam. Right there was the Vietnam War, because what it directly led to was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which laid the basis for United States entry into Vietnam. And I think that's the big difference.
Thank you. Mr. Policoff, the media since the Kennedy assassination has been very strong in its ability to investigate, to criticize, to have a healthy cynicism towards the actions of government, starting with with Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you think it failed with the Kennedy assassination?
Well, I'm not sure I would completely accept your premise, because I think the media coverage of the Vietnam War, until it became a mass movement, was very similar to the early media coverage of the Iraq War. I don't think it was very questioning. I don't think it was very questioning of Watergate until later on. Basically, the Washington Post carried the torch for over a year. Then the New York Times tried to play catch up, and once it became a major issue with major senior political figures calling for the impeachment of the president, then the floodgates opened. But I don't think the media... The one thing about the media coverage in the Kennedy assassination that I think is unique is that it was so overt. It was aggressive. It wasn't a matter of just towing the government line. It was a matter of going out and aggressively falsifying the story. And I mean, from CBS to the New York Times to Time Inc., they basically loaded the story and lied about the story, and it was not passive coverage by any means. It was very aggressive coverage. It was propaganda.
Thank you very much. Mr. Summers, in your remarks, you made the point about conspiracy theorists and all. And in a minute, could you tell us a little bit, isn't conspiracy theory very strong among Europeans?
I've been listening to the television just today since I arrived in America, and they keep saying it's a sort of European disease, believing in conspiracies. I don't think so, especially at all. Of course, we have a longer history, and therefore there have been more things that have involved conspiracies. But I don't think it really is a particularly American design. I think all officialdom, and certainly modern officialdom, resists the notion of conspiracy because it rocks the boat. I have to differ, though, somewhat on the media, and whether the media is sinister in its resistance of conspiracy theories. I think it can be, but mostly it's just damned lazy. And just in 10 seconds, let me tell you that when I went down the road for the BBC and started digging into this one, I went to the two places that probably, I think everyone would agree that in terms of human witnesses matter most: New Orleans and Mexico City. Oswald was in both places in the summer and fall of 1963. In both places, and in Dallas too, I would knock on the doors of people and say, look, I almost start with an apology. I'm very sorry, I'm here, I'm sure that you've talked to journalists time after time after time, and they'd either, punch me on the nose or kick me out because they didn't want to talk at all, or they would open the door and say, come in, where have you been all these years? Remember, this is late 70s. Where have you been? Nobody ever came and asked before. And that's the shame. It was ineptitude and laziness.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wrone, I'd like to ask essentially the same question as I'd asked of Mr. Sklar. Were things really different during Kennedy's administration than they were before and after?
I think Kennedy was starting to change with the American University speech in June, and then the movement with the Russians in August with the nuclear treaty, and all sorts of conversations and so forth with his advisors like Kenny O'Donnell and so forth that suggest that. I think there's two Kennedy administrations, the one up to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the one afterwards. And I think that American University speech of June 1963 is a fundamental document in American history.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a few minutes for questions from you, the members of the audience. Do we have a microphone, something for people to come talk to? Okay.
Gary Aguilar.
Okay.
question. Oh, I'll start off asking a question as to Mr. Sklar. There is a very interesting piece about Jack Kennedy in Vietnam by Fred Kaplan, on MSN Slate. And the issue that he raises there is that Kennedy didn't just stand down his advisors with regard to intelligence matters, that he consistently stood against them, and there's no better example of that perhaps than than the Cuban Missile Crisis. There he stood against all of his advisors to do something that was being recommended. And Kaplan makes the point from the record. He says that when you've looked at the declassified files, you see Kennedy, unlike any president he's familiar with, having consistently stood down his advisors on the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the Bay of Pigs invasion, on troops into Laos, and ultimately, obviously, on Vietnam. I think that pattern of being willing to stand against your advisors is something that we haven't seen in presidents before, and it's a pity we haven't seen it since.
Well, I don't know that that's a question. I mean, I agree with you, and I haven't read that article, but it certainly is consistent with the record. I mean, anyone who's interested in Kennedy's position on Vietnam should read John Newman's book, JFK in Vietnam, in which repeatedly Kennedy is urged by his advisors to send troops into Laos, into Vietnam, and repeatedly he resists. That was also true during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he was urged to invade. And it was also true that his advisors did not want him to sign a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. He did that over their objections as well. So the American University speech, I think I agree, is crucial, because what it shows is that Kennedy had a premature affinity for a possible détente with the Soviet Union and also with Cuba. He had initiated these back-channel communications with Castro to normalize relations, diplomatic relations. This is the kind, and he had shut down some of the training camps of those who were training to launch a second invasion of Cuba, trained by the CIA. These were very radical acts. Maybe we don't consider them radical, but certainly the people who consistently wanted to, were pushing for invasions of countries, some of them very small, but very important symbolically. Why should anybody care if a small country like Cuba is communist? Why should they care if Vietnam is communist? You have China and Soviet Union, which are enormous countries that are already communist. Well, these are model states. If some place like Cuba becomes communist and it proves to be a model society that others in Latin America can look to and try to emulate, then you get a Grenada, then you get a Nicaragua. That's precisely what the people in the intelligence and defense establishments did not want. They called it the domino theory, and it is that Kennedy was all of a sudden questioning by his actions. I don't know that he had a philosophical view that had been worked out completely. I think he was leaning and I think he was changing, but I think that's what was in the wind, and that's what I think people in the intelligence and defense and foreign policy establishments were very, very worried about. It was their advice that was being resisted.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Brown.
The questioner, by the way, was Gary Aguilar, Dr. Gary Aguilar, and he will be speaking, and please, please, please do not miss his remarks. I'd just like to add to what Zach said, and also to what David said. Historically, the president that you could say most walked away from his advisors prior to JFK was somebody named Lincoln. We know what happened to him. And in terms of the American University speech on June 10th, Lincoln's second inaugural, they're the same thing. They both say the same thing, and they're both profound statements.
Is there another question?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First, I'd like to make a comment. to Mr. Summers to thank him for being here, because I think his book, Not in Your Lifetime, is one of the best on the topic, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it for him to autograph mine. I'd like to thank Professor Wrone for his comments, which were unexpected, because I think nuclear proliferation is still a great problem. And I learned of the comments that he just spoke about in my research about the assassination. And I don't have any doubt that if JFK's opponent had been elected in 1960, and if the Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred, that we wouldn't be here debating this subject. And people need to think about that seriously. So I appreciate your comments tonight, which were unexpected. And I also have a question for Mr. Policoff, because I read your article in the book, The Script of JFK the Movie, about the changes to Life magazine that you mentioned, and I have owned 2 sets of those October '64 issues that were changed twice, and I think my question about them is probably a little too lengthy to ask you about right now. But I still have one of those sets, and the changes I know were expensive and not all that detailed, but I think I've figured out in what order they were made and so forth, and I'd like to know if you'd have time to discuss that briefly later.
Sure.
To see if my findings match yours as far as when they were put out and how the changes were made and so forth.
I don't know how they were made. I know there were 3 different versions, and I was on a panel at NYU with Dick Stoley of Life, I guess it was about 5 years ago, and he claimed to be completely mystified. He claimed he never knew that had happened, and which I find hard to believe.
Well, my understanding is that he always insisted that out of good taste, Life never printed frame 313 until 1983, and the first frame is 323. That's the frame in question, and I think that's what they first printed.
323 was they printed originally, and that's what gave the impression the head had been thrown backwards, so that they
snapped to the side.
They replaced that with frame 312
or 313. And then they printed it again and changed the caption. So that's what I kind of suspected too. And I thought it a bit strange that he didn't know that that had been substituted in later editions. And I found out about that in your article and collected the magazines, and people just don't believe me. And I have them. And
I have all 3. I mean, there's no question about it.
And that's quite interesting. No, people won't believe that Life broke the plates and remailed out the magazines with different captions to fit the Warren Commission, and they did. The proof is there. So
I don't know of any other case like that where plates were broken twice and 3 different versions of a magazine was published. And again, today it wouldn't be a big deal, because with digital technology it would be fairly cheap to do it, but it wasn't cheap back in 1964.
It cost them several $1 million, but you're not the only person with the set, so I'm glad somebody else has them too.
Thank you very much. Is there another question?
Yes. I'd like to raise another idea that I think is important as to why the inquiry into the Kennedy assassination shouldn't be dropped. And that is that the positions of power that existed back in the 1960s were occupied by some individuals that could be the architects of this assassination. Well, those positions of power probably exist today, may be occupied by other individuals, and unless we know who occupied those positions of power, the names of those individuals, how can we understand how our government really works today? Maybe Mr. Sklar would be the best one.
Yes, I agree with that completely. I mean, one can talk theoretically forever, about big forces and ideas of what might have motivated the assassination. But it's as Cyril Wecht said, what really needs to happen here is the hard digging of who was occupying what position, who was making the decisions on specific issues at the time. And it's very hard to do that when you're talking about an agency like the Central Intelligence Agency, which basically is a secret operation. We don't even know what their budget is. People estimate it's $30 billion a year. It's hidden in some line in the budget somewhere. We're paying for that. When JFK came out, a friend of mine, Danny Schechter, went to the KGB to get their file on Oswald. It was perestroika. He got the file from the KGB. He couldn't get a similar file from the CIA. There was more freedom of information coming out of the KGB under perestroika than there was from our own CIA. This is really the problem. Unless there's an outcry from the population, as there was to open up these records, it's going to be very difficult to establish who was doing what. But similar things are happening now. We have decisions being made based on intelligence reports that we never see. We go to war based on these intelligence reports that there are weapons of mass destruction. We never see them. So it's who is making these decisions? That's, I think, precisely the question. And I don't know how we're going to get to that as long as we countenance an agency that can hide behind the general term national security to keep everything secret. And we have an administration today that is trying to make things even more secret. You know, we have George W. Bush seals the records of the Reagan administration arbitrarily. We'll never, you know, it's harder to know what happened in Iran-Contra. There are a number of scandals, and that this is exactly the problem we're up against. We're dealing with a secret government, and it really is going to demand that the American population rise up and demand that the secrecy end, because, you know, the rationale used to be, well, we can't do these things for national security because the Soviet Union will find out. Well, then there was no Soviet Union. Then all of a sudden, well, now the terrorists are going to find out. You know, how long are they going to get away with this? You know, it's something that only an engaged, angry population that's going to change that. It's going to demand that we know what happened and in these agencies, and that the individuals responsible be named and accountable.
Could I come in there with a specific point that ought to make you, I think, feel angry? The reason that I changed the title of my book from Conspiracy to Not in Your Lifetime in a recent edition is because I didn't want to be, because I have several ways of thinking about whether I'm for conspiracy or not. I called it conspiracy because a congressional committee said it was probably conspiracy. I changed it to Not in Your Lifetime because Chief Justice Warren said that there may be some things that cannot be released in your lifetime, things that involve intelligence. And what is not at all in doubt is that in spite of the JFK Act on releasing records in the 90s, the agencies still are hiding things. And here's the little anecdote. Lee Harvey Oswald went to Mexico City shortly before the assassination, and he went to the Cuban and Soviet diplomatic missions there. And he was being surveilled, which was par for the course, by American surveillance, by American intelligence, perfectly proper. And photographs were taken of him going and coming from those diplomatic missions, and sound recordings were taken. There were transcripts of them. But when asked about these, the CIA said that they were such routine surveillance materials that the tapes, for example, had been wiped routinely before the assassination. This was accepted for years and years. When we were researching it for the Frontline program, I think in 93, 94, we called up the guy who'd been the deputy chief of the CIA in Mexico City at the time. And he said, we asked about these tapes, and he said, I'm not at liberty to tell you what was in my mind in 1963. We said, well, we weren't asking what was in your mind, we wanted to know about whether the tapes existed. Were they really destroyed, wiped before the assassination? He said, well, I'm not at liberty to tell you what was in my mind, and we got nowhere at all. Then I found myself talking to one of the Warren Commission counsel, David Slawson, who said that he had physically been down there in March 1964 and listened to the tapes. "Oh," says I, "who did you go with?" And he went with William Coleman, who later became, I think, Secretary for Health under Reagan. And I went to William Coleman, and William Coleman said, "Yes, we went there, and the same deputy chief played us the tapes." So back we went, called up the deputy chief. I'm sorry this takes a long time to tell, but it still should make you angry at the end. The deputy chief said, "Well, now, if those two attorneys have told you that, then I can admit it. Yes, the tapes existed after the assassination." And the big question then comes, and this is the bit that should make you angry, is where are they now? If the tapes of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City going to those embassies existed in April 1964, why is it that when there's an act that to force release of all such documentation, that we are still not allowed to hear those tapes?
Ladies and gentlemen, our time is up. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a very interesting session. Thank you.